Please join me in welcoming Dr. Guilaine Kinouani.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here with me this evening. Thank you in particular to the Lord Mayor for joining us as we are going to think about the Kongo Kingdom, and essentially what I put forth to you, which is we remember the Congo without remembering the Congo. So the name of my lecture talk is entitled Remembering Without Remembering the Congo. I started with some Congolese music, typical Congolese music. It's called Sibin. We could do an anatomical, that's the word, yes, analysis of the song, and maybe we'll return to music. But I want to start by reading those two extracts from my latest book. The ill-defined Congo has featured heavily in white imaginaries as the land of savagery, barbarism, and colonialism, and cannibalism. Projected fantasies based on the atrocities inflicted on the region. An estimated 10 million Congolese people perished due to Belgian colonial extractive practices and their consequences. The English, the French, and in particular the Spanish and the Portuguese atrocities have arguably been erased from the global collective consciousness and from most historical accounts of the Congo when it comes to the slave trade. I argue, swallowed by the indigestibility of the Belgian colonial monstrosity. Yet, a further 6 million souls had before this been enslaved from the same region, about half the number of those extracted for the trade, with most taken to Latin America. So the purpose of the lecture, as has been announced helpfully by Michelle, is to think about the impact of the transatlantic slave on the Kongo Kingdom, but also to engage in an exploration of the disappeared presence of the Congo on the trade, and to think a little bit about the bidirectionality of that relationship. We want to consider whether a focus on West Africa has created a hegemony and compromised our understanding of the legacy of the trade geopolitically, culturally, and environmentally. I guess I want to think a little bit about Central Africa and about the Congos and about the Congo. So when I speak about the Congos, I'm making direct reference to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Republic of the Congo. When I speak of the Congo with a K, unless I've made any mistake, I am referencing the entire ancient kingdom. As I attempt to make this case, I'm going to touch upon a fundamental paradox that characterized the Congo and my encounter with the region. And I would like you to try as much as it is possible to meet the Congo, to encounter and to get to know the Congo if you don't know the region through my eyes. As is standard for me, I'm sorry I'm speaking a little bit turned because I need to face the screen. I can't see the screen in front of me too clearly. That's the reason I'm positioned here, so accept my apologies. So a mixed lived experience with stories, and that is to say autoethnography, with some analytic reflection and theorization. But again, I want you to connect to the Congo with the heart. And the heart is very, very, very important in Congolese epistemology because it is considered the center of intelligence. So I'm going to start by reading you my first story about the Congo, which is about the trip to the slave port of Luango that I took last year. And I wrote this note because I am a writer, so I write, and I memorialize in that way. And I journal quite a bit. So I wrote this note about 3 weeks or so after I returned from the Congo. And when I'm talking about my Congo, I'm talking about the Republic of Congo, so-called Congo-Brazzaville. So it's about 3 weeks now since I returned from the land of my ancestors, and it's about 3 weeks that I have been trying to write about the Congo. It's about 3 weeks now that I have been struggling to find the words. So I decided today to write anyway, to honor the struggle, to struggle aloud. What am I struggling with? Who am I struggling with? It was a short trip, only 11 days, but it was an intense trip. I saw distant family, most of them for the first time. I went up and down the country. I visited the slave port of Luango, the Phantom Port, a port without a port, as I call it, where all those millions of helpless and frightened souls were dispatched from and into the unknown of the Americas and into the West Indies to be worked to death or to be murdered in transit, at sea or on land. I visited museums, and they felt like spiritual places, inhabited spaces, not only by the ornament and exhibit on display. It felt as though there were souls protecting these walls, in some ways, haunted. Perhaps this explains the absence of security around the art pieces, which initially took me by surprise. I asked searching questions. Sometimes they were answered directly, sometimes they could not be answered. Mostly I heard what I wanted and what I needed to know. In some ways, at times I was left hanging, frustrated, unknowing. I went and paid homage to my late father. He lay buried in a white marble grave in a private cemetery in the capital, the province of important people. I brought him roses, and I laid my hands on his tombstone for the first time. A close encounter with death in the midst of the heat and the thickness of the rainforest. I discovered more about the country's hidden colonial atrocities. I did not know that was possible, but I've come to believe that colonialism is like a bottomless pit of depravity. The more you seek, the more you find. There is no end. I was at times rendered dizzy by the unspeakability of what that land carries, the blood that runs through the soil, and the paradox of the bone-chilling beauty. In the midst of it all, I confronted that dense denial and dissociation when I attempted to pay my homage to those ancestors who were forcefully departed from the land. The stolen lives, denial and dissociation, which so strongly echo the absence of Central Africa and the absence of the Congo from conversation on enslavement in the African and Black diaspora in particular. The collective black dot, I say, on our consciousness. I cried, and I wanted to fall to my knees and ask for forgiveness for not being robust enough to hold the memory of the horrors that had been done to them. We were so feeble that we had to let that port disintegrate into nothingness, vanish into thin air, into the sand, into the sea, like these very tormented bodies, again, we were never to see. I did not get to my knees. It is in my heart that I said sorry. And it was on my return, a few weeks after I got home, that I noticed something important. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look at what is left of the port of Luango. So that is a picture that I took myself last April. And so you can see the old docking station where the port used to be and the slave ships posted. You can also see a sort of tree-like structure right opposite the docking station and before the sea. A bamboo-like tree growing in the middle of the sand. Can you see it in the middle of the picture? Where, I guess, frightened and often wounded bodies stood in line, where I too felt overwhelmed, shocked by the absence of memorialization in the midst of the heavy hair. Now, I cannot be 100% certain, but I presume this is a spontaneous growth. Nothing suggests that it is human-generated. It was not highlighted as remarkable or as a point of note by my guide. There is no plaque, and it looks somewhat unkempt. But I noticed its placement and apparent significance in relation to issues of memorialization. I guess my conclusion was that I was so distraught that the port had disappeared, that its tangibility was missing, and by the lack of human memorialization, that is to say, by what was absent, by what I wanted to be there. A place which would allow me to mourn, I thought, properly. And perhaps in my fantasy lay to rest those ghosts. I did not notice what was actually present. What was staring at me all along had become invisible. So one question that we want to ask ourselves is whether, I went too fast, sorry, whether there is any form of ecological memorialization that can happen in the absence of human memorialization. It's an interesting question. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about me first. I am, for all intents and purposes, a French woman. I was born in Paris, Bastille, and I grew up in, as I say, the French ghetto. And my interest in investment in the Congo is personal, of course, but it is also scholarly. But I did not seek to study the Congo. Arguably, it sought me out, and we'll return to that. It is my investigation of racial trauma, of intergenerationality, and issues to do with transmission, embodiment, and communication that led me back to my ancestors. As I said, I grew up in the inner cities, mainly amongst West African communities, people from Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, when I made my first friend, very first friend, and when I tasted my very first jollof, for those of you who follow the war, Senegalese jollof all the way. There was a Congolese community that maintained some customs and some tradition, but rarely spoke about colonialism, certainly not enslavement. I would occasionally hear my friend from West Africa talk about the trade as a way to claim affinity or affiliation with African American artistic production, which was essentially the bulk of what we consumed growing up. But I remember vividly trying to broach the subject of the trade as a child and hearing as a retort, it wasn't our people. And that phrase could mean many, many things. It could mean it was not our people who were stolen and brutalized. It could also mean it was not because of our people that Congolese people were brutalized or stolen or kidnapped into enslavement. Now, I don't know exactly what was meant because I didn't ask. I didn't feel that I could ask. But I know that it was some kind of distancing or dissociation maneuver. And I experienced these 5 words. It was not a people as a door being shut in my face. A foreclosing of my inquiries and sense of curiosity. But I could still feel the kind of angst, the fear, the anguish behind the sternness. So I knew that there was a story behind that door. And I recognized echoes of that stories or that dissociation when I visited Elmina in Ghana. Was it your people? I was asked, as I was trying to connect to the suffering and the atrocity that had been done to the people of West Africa. So, as a reminder, dissociation is a core symptom of traumatization. And again, I recognized that anguish and fear when I felt that my parents were trying to discourage me from being too interested in Congolese politics and being too interested in the history of the Congo. Some relatives even told me that I was messing with the spirits of the dead. And I do think that there are spirits in archival work, and I might return to that. And I know that those were people who care for me. So I know that they were trying to protect me from the atrocities that I was still to discover. But I understand today, of course, that is not the entire story. Now, in order to understand the Congo and its contribution, we need to locate it geographically, geopolitically, and maybe even territoriality. So let's start with Western Central or Western Central Africa. What does it mean? What is it? So it is a common phraseology, you would have heard it, that designates the part of Africa that was directly brutalized by the slave trade. So it covers 23 countries, 14 are francophones, 5 are anglophones, and 3 are lusophones. You have a full list here for those who are interested. So as you can see, Western Central Africa covers a wide range of land and climate. But for the interest of today, it's not as important. Suffice to say that we are talking about 23 countries, and there are 54 countries in Africa. So pretty much half of Africa we're talking about. Now, what is Central Africa? Let's try to narrow it down, getting closer and closer to the Congo. It depends on who you ask the question. I grew up, I was taught in geography lessons and in history lessons that Central Africa, in the strictest sense, is the region that is the region of Africa that surrounds the equators, right? And that is more or less fed by the Congo River. That's what I was taught as a child, right? So if it's not served by the Congo River, it must be touched by the rainforest. So that delineation at the time included the Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and Cameroon. Now, today, according to the European Union of the European Union's diplomatic service, the region of Central Africa includes 11 countries: Angola, Burundi, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Republic of the Congo, and Sao Tome and Principe. In part due to historical and colonial ties, some countries have been included in the region, even though strictly speaking, they are located, we are told, in Eastern Africa, such as Burundi and Rwanda. So we can see that the category has got quite large, vague, vast, and it now includes a majority of land that are spread again across region. It was already straight to start with, but you know, from desertic area to tropical area to coastal zone, we are talking about a very bulk section of Africa, just Central Africa. Now, the Congo with a K. The Congo was a sophisticated Bantu monarchy or kingdom in Central Africa, in existence between more or less 1390 and 1857. And it comprised, I think there are less dispute on that, of northern Angola, the western part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the entire Republic of the Congo, and the southern part of the Gabon. The kingdom functioned mostly as an independent state until contact with Portugal, who started to use it as a vassal until the Berlin Conference and the infamous Cromwell for Africa. So we can see now that there are 4 nations concerned by the Kongo Kingdom. That's very important. As we get narrower and narrower to who exactly are those people who were enslaved from the Kongo Kingdom, from Central Africa. We're already narrowing down to 4 countries. Let's continue. Now, initially Portuguese got involved in the Kongo Kingdom for the extraction of certain minerals and resources, and eventually that led to the extraction of human lives. And then they were followed by the French, the Spanish, the English, and the Dutch to a lesser extent. That's very important. We have quite a bit of evidence now, genetically, fairly recent, that highlight how the transatlantic trade can trace the history, the African history of the people who were deported, who were captured to the America. So there's strong connection to present-day Angola and to the Congos, and very specifically the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Of the 12.5 million estimated, depending on, again, who you ask the question, Africans forcibly transported between 1525 and 1866, about half came from the Kongo Kingdom. I want to repeat that. Out of the 12 million or so Africans taken forcibly to the Americas, half came from the Kongo Kingdom. They didn't come from Central Africa, they came from the Kongo Kingdom. So, this is important, so we know that at least at large, about 50% of the enslaved were the descendant of Congolese with a big K. But if we look at very specific area, for example, the southern United States, the Congolese represented the largest single group among the enslaved Africans. Who knew that? Put your hands up if you knew that. 1, 2, 3. 3 hands. 4. Okay. In Haiti, I think more people probably would know that. How many people knew that? Oh, not that many more. Okay. Cuba, Brazil. Okay, Brazil, more people know. Okay. Brazil. So those tend to be, for us Congolese people, Congolese descended people, they tend to be Congolese hotspot, where we know those are our people. They were taken there. And Brazil is quite significant because, of course, in case you don't know, I think about half the population that was enslaved at large was taken to Brazil. So if we think that the majority of people taken to Brazil were descendants of the Congo, that gives you, I guess, a sense of the magnitude of the people who were extracted from this region. Little diagram with numbers. Okay, so I guess the question that we need to ask ourselves is, given that nobody knew that, I mean, I'm Congolese descended, I suspected there was something going on, but I didn't know that it was what was going on. So given that pretty much nobody in this room, give or take maybe 10%, knew about that history today, and I will consider you fairly well educated, clearly interested, that's why you're here today. How do we make sense of that erasure? How do we make sense of the erasure of 50% of the enslaved when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade disappeared from collective memorization, from narrative around enslavement? We'll see in a moment from popular culture. How might we explain that? There's lots of hypotheses that we can put forth to try and make the case that there is a hegemony. So first of all, we need to think about the role of the US geopolitically, culturally, and linguistic. I would say imperialism, which means that we tend to focus on English history. Right? We tend to focus on the happening related to the Americas, to the United States very specifically. Related to that, a large proportion of the scholarship on enslavement originates from Anglophone countries, right? And it's written in English, the bulk of it. I'd say easily 80%, if not 90%. And so that means that unless you are English or and bilingual like me, and so you can read both and you can access literature that exists that's not written in English, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand other parts of the transatlantic slave history, but also the scholars that don't write in English don't really get a moment to say what they have to say. A big point, which I've kind of started with, the atrocities of the genocide, that's a controversial term, I might return to that later, of the Belge, 10 million people we say, some people go as high as 15. Well, let's stick to 10 million, killed, murdered under the reign of Leopold II. Basically it swallowed up all conversation about the Congo, because when we think about the Congo, we think about Belgium, right? As though the French were more kind. But let's focus on the Belge for now. The umbrella term, I think that is also linguistically quite an important point. The umbrella term West Central Africa means that Central is almost an add-on. Or perhaps people imagine that West Central refers a central region of West Africa, as opposed to the amalgamation of two regions, right? And the juxtaposition of those two areas. Again, we have to remember, we're talking about 23 countries when we're talking about the self-draw. Oh, 22 countries. Well, actually, 3 countries, possibly 2 countries, contributed 50% of the slave. Okay, so if we think a little bit about culture, what's going on? I would argue that the Heart of Darkness by Conrad is still with us in terms of the imaginary that it has produced, the kind of colonial mysticism and the fantasies of the primitive and the jungle and the savage are very much connected to Africa, but actually those fantasies are, I would say, speak of the Congo much more than they speak of other regions of Africa, I would say. As an example, when I moved into this country, and I was just from Paris, and I met this young man who was right from Nigeria. And so we were just talking about our mutual kind of background, and I was telling him about life in the inner city, and he was telling me about life in Lagos, and then we started to talk about my ancestry, and he said, where are you from originally? And I said, oh, I'm Congolese descended. And he went, oh, the Congo, the Congo. you are from Africa, Africa. So I thought I was French of African descent, but all of a sudden I became African. And so there was something that completely englobed all part of my identity because, again, of that fantasy land created by colonialism. If we think about what has been produced artistically or culturally, and that has shaped our understanding of the Kongo Kingdom, the Congo region, Tintin au Congo, the comic by Hergé, which recounts the adventure, of course, of Congo in the DRC, and makes very heavy use of colonial tropes, including laziness, intellectual inferiority, and dependency. We have King Kong. Right? The name Kong in King Kong is believed to be inspired by the Congo. I mean, that's not very difficult to guess, by the Congo. And of course, is centered around that big, giant ape inhabiting a mysterious jungle-like environment to whom we must make human sacrifice. So you see the kind of imaginary that still surrounds the Congo, perhaps more subliminally today. Now, out of the dozen of small budget movies that I found when I was researching for this lecture, there is only one that I would say is not about the colonial imaginary and the fantasy of the jungle and savagery. And that is Scenes of Racial Hate, I think, which is set during the Belgian occupation. So there we go, the Congo and King Kong. You might think, well, what does it have to do with the erasure? I'll return to that later. So, to return to Tintin au Congo, let me give you a second to read these slides. There was a Congolese man who had attempted to argue in Belgium that the comic was racist or discriminatory and should either be censored, banned, or at least have some kind of notice to say that it was likely to offend people. And the Belgians said, no problem there at all. Nothing racist. Thank you. You can see that part of the, I'm not a lawyer, I'm interested, but I'm not a lawyer. Now, you would see that part of the reasoning extracted from the judgment is, it is clear that neither the story nor the fact that it has been put on sale has a goal to create an intimidating, hostile, degrading, or humiliating environment. Okay. Now, if you are familiar with equality legislation in this country, you know that impact or effect is as important as intent. Now here, it appears, from what I'm reading, that it was all about what did Hergé set out to do. Did he set out to be discriminatory in 1930s or 1920s? No, it didn't, so therefore it is not racist. Let us move on. The erasure of the Congo, if we focus a bit more, again, on focus, but here now looking at the trade, and I try to find the biggest movies about the trade, certainly that display the voyage, right? So we have the roots, possibly the biggest out of them all. It starts where? In the Gambia, West Africa. The roots, Kunta Kinte. I hope everybody's familiar with this bit of a cultural phenomenon. And then we have Amistad, directed by Spielberg, which depicts the revolt of the Mende people. Where are the Mende originally from? India. Correct. Then we have Belle. Belle, directed by Asante, which has the Zong story. Right, the Zong story, and display the kind of the tussling in court as to whether the cargo should be insured or not insured, and the cargo originated from Elmina. Where's Elmina? Ghana. Soul at Sea, which I haven't seen, directed by Hathaway, follows the essentially a itinerary of an enslaved ship or an enslaved people aboard a slave ship. And that ship came from West Africa. Sankofa, which displayed the story of an African black American model who is transported onto the enslavement of the West Indies while she goes and visits Elmina again, Ghana. Now, we need to also think that it cannot only be cultural phenomena. It cannot only be because of popular culture that the Congo has been erased, even though it plays a big part. And again, we're talking about bidirectionality. What came first? Did the psyche go first and then created the popular culture? Is it the popular culture that now impact how we remember or not remember? Or is there bidirectionality? I think it's the latter. But of course, I started to talk about trauma dissociation from history, pain, shame, particularly related to discourses of complicity. That's a big one across the diaspora. There is internalized racism related to the Congo because, you know, who wants to be associated with the land of savagery and cannibalism and all the fantasies that have been produced by colonial masters? We cannot escape the denial, in particular the denial in this part of the world, here, the part of the world directly impacted by or that directly brutalized the Congo, so Belgium. I'm going to speak about France, because I know France, of course. Remember François Fillon? I think some of us were alive. That was about 10 years ago. And how he described colonialism, oh, it was just France trying to share its culture with the people of Africa. But you can't get more deeper denial than that, really. And also quite offensive, quite violently offensive. There is also, we could argue, an overwhelm in a context where we must remember that still a large part of the Kongo Kingdom, of the former Kongo Kingdom, is still at war. And the two Congos in particular are still vulnerable to war, in part because of neocolonialism. And so in this context, people feel overwhelmed. It's just too much to think about. It's just too much to process, too much to worry about. So there is a form of competition for cognitive energy and processing and digesting. I call the Congo the graveyard of Africa. So I guess the question for us is how much death and dying can the brain comprehend, really, right? How much violence is the human mind capable of registering before it shuts down and refuses to see? And there is, I'd say, also a tendency to idealize an elsewhere from people who are descended from the slave and the enslaved and the diasporian at large. When we feel alienated, when we feel marginalized, we want a home somewhere. We want an ideal home that is unitary, monolithic. And so that also foster oversimplification of what that home might be. Now, having made the case, I hope that the Congo has indeed been erased, certainly from popular culture and public discourses on the trade. I want to focus a bit on the endurance of the Congo. How does the Congo persist? How does the Congo resist? And how do we remember, I guess? So let's think a little bit about remembering. Very basic definition. To remember is to be able to bring back a piece of information in our mind or to keep a piece of information in our memory. So to keep it in our memory. So that's the Cambridge Dictionary. To bring back, of course, suggests that there was at some point in experience some kind of direct exposure to something. And that something needs to be processed, right? And it needs to be put away in some way. Here we say in the memory. Memory, therefore, we could say has been defined mainly as the mental ability to encode, to store, and to retrieve data so that it can affect how we move into the world in our future action. So we can see that we tend, certainly within Western thinking at large, we tend to think about memory in terms of cognitive processes, even though we do know that remembering involves the senses, that it involves the body, but also that it involves processes that go beyond the body and that go beyond the senses. So processes that are extrasensory and outside the realm of the material or the physical. And that's particularly important, of course, when we think analytically, when we think in terms of African cosmology or philosophy at large. Okay, so let's think about this frame that is called post-memory. Generally, I would say that analytic thinkers from Freud onward have thought about matters of memory in the context of historical atrocities and intergenerationality for some time. So the thinking is not necessarily new. Whether it has been applied in a context, generally no, but the thinking in and of itself is not new. The common thread, regardless of the concept used, I give you some of the concepts that exist to try to make sense of issues of permanence, of memory in the absence of direct exposure. You have concepts like spectres, like ghosts, like haunting, like telepathy. So a lot of people have been thinking about how is it that generations that have not experienced a particular trauma or atrocity seem to be connected to it, to remember it, or to even be affectively affected by it. But essentially the core idea about memory and trauma analytically is that the generation who have initially encountered a trauma, for whatever reason, well, you can guess the reason, for whatever reason, dissociate from it. So they dissociate from that experience because it is too painful, because it is too demanding cognitively, because it is too anxiety-provoking. So because they distance themselves from the original trauma, that experience becomes transferred, communicated to subsequent generations. Generally, that is the bulk of how analytic thinkers tend to think about intergenerational trauma and how those memory and suffering can be passed on from generation to generation to generation. So here, one core idea is that when there is silence, there is communication. So violence is a vector of transference to further generation who may, quote unquote, uncannily experience what it has never been told, what it seems like it never knew. So you know something, but actually you don't know how you knew it. And the hypothesis is that it has been transferred to you unconsciously by your parents or your forebears. But of course, if we're thinking about the unconscious, there needs to be some physical context, some physical contact. There needs to be one mind, another mind, one body, another body. Otherwise, there's no conscious communication in that sense, according to that framework. There's other way to think about that, but according to that dominant frame. So in summary, we could say that silence is a key mechanism of communication and unconscious transmission. So you could say that absence of verbalization ensures presence. Post-memory is a frame that kind of challenged this idea somewhat. And it describes how individuals inherit and process trauma of their forebears, even though they did not personally experience that trauma and the wounding event. So they become impacted by the memories, by those narratives that they hear, and come to relate to them as though it was their own memory, as though it was their own experience, through hearing or being exposed to the traumatic experience of others. There is, therefore, you could say, some kind of imaginative investment which relies on projection. So the generation as they speak, it's very unclear, so it's quite vague, but generation as they speak of their trauma, you could say offload unconsciously, transmit unconsciously to the hearers, usually the children. The affective element of their memories. And that affective element is so powerful, is so potent, that the people who receive and hear the story, or who are confronted to, say, object of memorization, come to relate to those memories as it was them who had experienced this very suffering. Hirsch makes the distinction between familial and affiliative post-memory. With affiliative post-memory, identification and a sense of responsibility may be triggered by memorization, such as photograph stories, going to museum, encountering artifact that speaks to a particular traumatic period. So you don't necessarily need to hear others in your family. Just the exposure to even inanimate object can trigger affiliative post-memory. With familial post-memory, she says there is a process of inheritance. And she proposed that it is largely, again, dependent on unconscious transmission that is involved. That's the frame. So post-memory is based on the notion that there's been exposure to the people who have not themselves experienced a trauma. So therefore, that exposure is vicarious when it comes to the event themselves, but it is direct when it comes to the act of memorization. So there's still some kind of exposure that is hypothesized. I'm not sure myself I would make a very strong distinction between affiliative post-memory and familial post-memory. And I wonder whether the distinction is based on a model of a family, and so therefore communication from grandparents, parent to child, that is not only linear, but also quite nuclear in its formation. So therefore I would say that's quite Eurocentric. And also there are something that challenge, if we were to think outside the familial post-memory, there's something that challenge the unconscious, right? The formation of the unconscious, and therefore makes explanation that rely on the psyche quite difficult to sustain. Myself personally, I say that the imagination and fantasy element are present, but I wonder whether they are somewhat overplayed, and I also find them somewhat reductionist and certainly hyper-rationalist. So that's why I attempt to reframe, or at least supplement some of those ideas with element of real knowing. So what I'm saying is that it's not all fantasy. Right? What I'm saying is that it's not all kind of imaginative formation, that there is indeed a real knowing of objective reality. So we need to move a little bit beyond psychic reality and to propose that there may be element of objective reality that can be graspable via mechanism that we found difficult to accept because they are non-rational. So I center intuition, but there might be others. Some people might think about the spiritual, for example, and indeed some people link intuition to spirituality. Now, I'm going to tell you a few stories about theft. This is what I wrote a few weeks ago. I shared an experience on a train, and I was returning to London from Paris. I felt the sudden urge to grab and hide my phone when a random white man got into a train. that I was sat on. I felt very silly. There was apparently no reason to feel threatened. That guy, within about 3-4 minutes, went on to snatch the phone of a Chinese tourist and jump off the train. That's my first story. Second story. I stayed in an Airbnb. That happened about a month or so, maybe a month and a half ago. I stayed in an Airbnb early in the week where I was working from. I had my head buried in my computer when 2 black guys got into the house. And I got that very same impulse to protect my belonging. It was instant and upon their mere sight. So I got up in a hurry and I tried to get to my phone and all the stuff that I had left in the shared part of the accommodation. Again, I felt silly, quite bad, especially because they were black and I was thinking I'm stereotyping them and there's no reason for me to be suspicious of them. Still, I packed my stuff anyway, then left the property for the day. And upon my return in the evening, the only 2 things of value that I had not packed, 2 designer perfume, were missing. I had forgotten to check the bathroom for valuables. And it was not supposed to be shared, but it was not lockable from the outside. I'm going to tell you a final story about theft. I was 5 or 6 when I woke up in the middle of the room, afraid that something was being done to the family car. We had all gathered around the telly for movie night, and I had dozed off, and I was now agitated and screaming, the car, the car. I had never noticed any car theft, and there had not been any attempt on a property before our day. It was a brand new car, and it was a prized possession. It was a Renault Nevada, for those who know cars. And it had taken my mother many sacrifices and long night shifts to put the deposit together so we could be approved for the loan. So we hadn't even paid the entire car. There had been a family meeting and a vote on whether the money, which was eventually allocated to the car, should take the family on a trip to Africa, which was the other option. And the family had decided on the car. So when we got the car, we became the envy of the neighborhood. Few were the family with brand new cars, even on finance. And even as a child, I could feel the energy or the disturbance that the car created. And it seemed that I alone carried the burden of noticing it. So in that moment, on that night, I knew that the car was in danger. And all I could say was, the car. I was half asleep, but clearly petrified and determined to pre-warn the warning of what I feared was unfolding, to pre-warn the family, sorry, of what I fear was unfolding, but which I could not quite explain. Amidst the bewilderment and the puzzled gaze, my mother, who was the only person who called the shot in our house, asked for someone to go and check the car. And so everybody started to rush for the window to make sure that the car was intact and that it was still parked at the bottom of the tower. And sure enough, when they opened the window, they found that 2 men, white, were breaking into it. So they were caught red-handed in the dark of the night, and we were seconds away from at least a certain heartache, if not significant financial difficulties. Now, what do we make of those 2 stories? I have a personal connection to theft because when I traveled to Africa, I was told by elders in my community that our ancestral land, which we still have, were extracted without our consent. Very specifically, I have an uncle, more than one uncle, but the uncle that was still alive when the story got round was an artist, a sculptor. So he was a very renowned sculptor, and he was sculpting from clay, I think, or from ground, ancestral ground. He didn't know that the ground carried gold, little nuggets of gold. And the colonial master had heard of the story, that there were nuggets of gold. And so they came rushed for the sculpture because the sculpture contained little pieces of gold. And so for generation and generation, our land was extracted of gold without us knowing that we were giving away gold. We are being stolen. So that is my personal familial connection to theft, but also without thinking too much about the extraction of resources and minerals of the Congo, we can understand why I might be quite intuitively attuned to theft. It would make sense, at least in theory, it would make sense. So my hypothesis is that the Congo also endures through our intuitive attunement in the absence of communication, conscious or unconscious, from our parents. It may act as a form of community protection. So the question that we ask to ask ourselves is that, do we all equally carry the burden of either knowing, or in the case of post-memory, post-remembering, knowing what has been done in the past? I say no. I'm open to challenge. I say no. Certainly my experience is that there are people within groups, within communities, within family who seem to carry that burden. And so this is based on my experience, of course, and my thinking around issues of transmission, intergenerationality, and inheritance. And I've also seen that within people that I've worked with who have experienced great atrocities, so I've worked, for example, clinically, quite a lot of Jewish people, that there seem to be someone within the community. There seem to be someone within a particular familial unit who carries the burden of remembering, right? And of course, people would say, certainly within analytic thinking, they would say, oh, that's because they over-identify more than others. But, you know, I don't know. Myself, I'm not very convinced. That's the sole explanation. So, beyond difference in identification, if we think a little bit about African philosophy and Congolese formulation, we can perhaps enrich our understanding of that phenomenon of the person who carries the burden of remembering or of knowing. Here are some precepts of African philosophy. They include things like everything is interconnected. Of course, nothing exists in isolation. Life is a communion of soul that transcends the limitation of time and space. Our understanding of the world cannot be served by a linear perspective, or certainly a linear perspective alone. The natural world is imbued with power beyond that we can understand by Western logics alone. Intuitive knowledge is important, sophisticated, and should be trusted and taken seriously. I've spoken before about the Nzonzi, because I'm Congolese descended, but essentially, you think Nzonzi, it's pretty much a griot-like figure of the Kongo Kingdom, believed to be selected in some ways in the Congo, we would say spiritually, maybe in group analysis, we would say by group unconscious to transmit community knowledge. And so the griot or the Nzonzi, they constitute links between the living and the dead, the past and the present, and they ensure the survival of heritage from generation to generation. They act as protection. I guess part of their role is to ensure that the community is protected as much as it can, so therefore that the community can be sustained. I'm going to read you, I'm doing fun time, okay, a story about Mary. Mary is a Congolese woman, and she came to the UK to seek asylum. You can find that story in my first book. She's a beautiful woman, and she is in her early 30s. She has experienced and witnessed some of the ugliest violence humans are capable of inflicting on one another. She was tortured, she was held captive, and she was raped during war. Mary had seen her son, careful, that's going to be difficult to hear, mutilated to death. And she and I crossed paths in a detention center in the UK where I worked. And she hardly spoke English or French. And I could hardly speak Lingala. So we found it very difficult to communicate. And still, she came to me again and again. There are other people in the department. Okay, I was the head, but she came to me constantly. She was battling repeated attempts from the government to deport her. I say the shameless racism of the hostile environment, a monster of a different kind, but a monster nonetheless. When Mary dropped in, she would look for me and sit close to me, often in silence. Possibly the most sorrowful tears that I have ever borne witness to. One day, she came in, and she started sobbing uncontrollably. And she was back in my mind. I thought she was not with me, although her body was in the room. I imagined that she was reliving massacres, scenes of war, and of unspeakable violence, blood scenes, as I call them, scenes of horrors and of loss. It turned out that it was the anniversary of the bloody murder of her young son. And I sat by her in silence for perhaps 30 minutes. But I thought that I was losing her. She was going deeper and deeper into sorrow. What word of comfort could I even think of giving this horribly traumatized woman who was mourning so painfully the death of her son? How could I reconnect her to the world of the living and hold her without holding her and tell her that life was still worth living in the midst of the anti-Black detention she found herself in, captive once more, which was compounding her trauma? So I stood up. I went to my computer and I searched YouTube. I looked for a few Congolese songs and I played them. And I watched her instantly stand up and start dancing. And I joined her. And then little by little, I could see that she was rejoining me. Her eyes were alive again, and she had returned into the room. Music had brought her back from the dead and connected us to life. Now, let's think about how the Congo endures. As perhaps an illustration, we could use music. We need to remember, because there's a lot of talk about war and suffering and trauma, which is the story of the Congo, but it's not the entire story of the Congo, that despite the suffering and the erasure, the Congo and its people endure. So what was done endures, but also we endure as descendants of those atrocities, and also embody beauty, I say. So we have, for example, Congolese dancing, which is known throughout the world. That centers, some people say that we are the best dancer in the world. So if you know dancing, you can tell me if you agree. Centers connection to the self, to eroticism, the body, dance partner, the community, but also evidence the persistence of joy. The persistence of joy in the midst of the negation of life, which is quite extraordinary. As Mbembe said, the practice of joy before death. Dancing, finding the capacity to feel love and to see beauty in the world in the midst of unspeakable atrocity. That is really the Congo. It is also a form of music that is generative, that has produced overture, put some here. Hopefully I'm going to demonstrate that in a minute. And that evokes the sensual and the erotic, Congolese dancing, right? Touch, fluidity, smoothness, synchronization. There's a focus on the hips, the pelvis, and the navel, which is, of course, the core of life and life-making. And we have rumba as a further example of the genre. A quote by Audre Lorde kind of galvanized our mind. The dichotomy between the spiritual and the political is also false. resulting from an incomplete attention to our erotic knowledge. For the bridge which connects them is formed by the erotic and the sensual. Those physical, emotional, and psychic expression of what is deepest and strongest and richest within each of us, being shared, the passion of love in its deepest knowledge. Meaning, Dorothy is not making reference to sex, and I think that's important to highlight. She's making reference to deep source of knowledge, of knowing, of wisdom that exists within and that is fed by the erotic. Rumba. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read that. Rumba comes from kumba, which is a Kikongo word that means navel, if there is any Congolese in the room. I don't speak Kikongo, but I know a few words. And so rumba and kumba is the dance of the navel, hence the very famous rotation of the hips. We've seen that slide, I think, more or less. One thing to remember is that it sustained itself amidst the very Puritan Christianity that was imposed by colonial project. So there is really something that speaks of resistance, and that speaks to defiance in the existence of the Rumba throughout the Kongo Kingdom, of course, and we will see in a minute outside. So what did the enslaved from the Kongo Kingdom, which we said again, 50% of the people taken away, do? They wanted to connect with their ancestry, of course, and so the Congo is linked to jazz. That's not me saying that, actually. To Congolese kingdom that we can find also in the Caribbean, in Brazil, for example, the Congada. And it has generated many babies, like we can see here, right? Keep repeating that. Babies are very important. Okay, here are my conclusions, my good people. And if you have time, you can listen to some music. If you want to break, you can have a break. The interconnection between human trafficking, resource extraction, population displacement remains. And the Congolese mines and the extraction of the Congolese mine, land, and people continue to be a driver for violence and instability. And so the practice of enslavement and colonial brutality, we could say, really live on. So we have a form of modern-day slavery, human trafficking, child labor, people being forced to work in mine without pay, widespread mutilation, what does that speak to, and enslavement in the Congo today. That looks very much like what had happened a couple of centuries or a century ago. So I guess the question that we can ask ourselves is, our nation too doomed to repeat trauma history that they dissociate from? And that's not to deny that there are structural and geopolitical realities and inequalities, but I guess we want to also think about the collective and the social unconscious and the role that it plays in these repeated configurations. But of course, the reality is that the violence that is happening in that part of the world is tolerated because the colonial imaginary. Do you think that we would find it acceptable to have something like between 6–10 million people dying unnecessarily? 6–10 million people have died since 1995 or thereabout in the DRC, almost as it is part of our decor, right? If not for that colonial imaginary. I say it helps a little bit. And then we need I would argue that we are in the middle of a second industrial revolution with everything extracted from the Congo, including the cobalt, which we rely on, society rely on to function. And so that, again, very much echoes the first revolution, isn't it? The first industrial revolution and how the trade was required to feed the great need for industry. I said that as element of necropolitics, for people who are not familiar with the terms, it is essentially the idea that some people must die for other people to live. Here, we're talking about Congolese people, of course. Another reason that violence is tolerated is because of Western individualism and consumerism, where, you know, what happened in this part of the world somehow we feel is not connected to what is happening in this part of the world. And of course, as I argued, Congolese lives have lost all value. But again, we need to remember that the Congo is a land of paradox. It is the graveyard of Africa. It is also, anybody has traveled to the Congo? One. Would you agree that it is a land of extraordinary beauty? I mean, breathtaking beauty. I mean, tear-dropping beauty. And it's making very difficult. It's very difficult to reconcile that with the atrocity. And when I traveled and I was confronted again and again with this story of mass murder, of suffering, of mutilation, of blood, and then you step into this almost like Eden-like land, and your mind can't compute. Your mind really is struggling to take in the ugliness that this nation or this region has gone through with the outstanding beauty. I've never been brought to tears by beauty. I've been brought to tears by beauty in the Congo because it is absolutely stunning, some areas. And so you have the force of life that are constantly confronting the forces of death, inviting us to appreciate the expression of resistance in action, whether through dance and music and the hips, and through the intergenerational transmission of knowledge across the diaspora, across time and space, but possibly even through ecological resistance, where it's almost as though the environment said, you know, screw it. You don't want to mark this area, we will mark it. I will mark it. So it seems that despite the erasure and the absence and the collective kind of agreement on this forgetting, that if we pay attention, we can see the endurance of the Congo all around us and for some of us inside us. Now, I have some music that I can show you if
We've got
a little bit of time. Okay. Because I've told you, oopsie, oh, no, oh, yes, thank you. I've told you that the Congolese music, the hips, the rotation of the hips has been generative. So I'm going to try to make the case by looking at some dancing. Let's go. The first two videos are Congolese, traditional Congolese dancing, right? Oh. Thank you. Another traditional Congolese move. Ah, it's no music, but. Okay. If you don't call us Westline warriors for no reason. Okay, so adaptation of traditional music, rumba, that's Congo again, more modern, but you can see the rotation, right? Okay, and now across time and space, Brazil. You can see the rotation. Only 2 more short video. Thank you. That is Cuba, I think. And here it rotates. I think you can show the final video. Kampa, 80. Okay, it rotates. Okay, I think I've made my case. Thank you very much for your attention.
This has been a very special night and it's ended really well, because I'm sure Karen Gallagher, Failure and Maxine were really super excited because they are very good women in the city.
I have one thing to say, but it'll be very quickly.
Yeah. So that was really nice, thank you. We do have to end, but I am going to say thank you for taking the time to come here and for you all to come out tonight and attending what has been a great insight into such an important subject. I also want to give special thanks to NML's Learning and Participation Team and Community Engagement Team and its Respect Group, who all work extremely hard to pull this together alongside all the other NML staff and team support. I do want to give a little shout out to the A team from the area that were involved in the organising of it, and that's Maxine Brown, Nasha Elliott, Ellis, Lewis, and many others. But thank you to them. Organising it for us, so well done. Great event. Tomorrow we will start our journey again as we recognise this very special date in our calendar of remembrance, with our walk of remembrance that will take place through the streets of the Liverpool city centre, uniting communities to mark our Slavery Remembrance Day. We will begin at 12 noon in Wilson Square, as we do year on year, and the walk will conclude at the Liverpool waterfront with our libation ceremony to our ancestors, and with, for this year, our masquerade performance, as well as performances throughout the war from Positive Impact and very many others. So I do hope to see some people tomorrow. I do know it's hard to make that decision, but I can say we will be there. We're not going to stop, and we're going to continue. I'll let Dr. Knott, Dr. Knott is going to be with us as well, aren't you? Tomorrow?
Yes.
Yes. So I'll let her have the very final last words, and then I'll let her say goodbye.
Thank you so very much. There was one thing that I wanted to make clear, and I guess that goes back to the issue of the griot and the nzonze. I'm called doctor because the doctorate that I have is honorary. And it is honorary, and it is related to my contribution to analytic thinking. Now, I want to say that, again, I started with, it was not your people. Several times I was told it wasn't my people. And I was discouraged from thinking about the aftermath of colonialism and the aftermath of enslavement from all corners, including professionally. But I persisted, and like the Congo, I endured, and that earned me a doctorate. So I just wanted to add that.